So this particular international webinar on field hydrology, it is a work it has been materialized by the efforts of two institutes, National Institute of Engineers Mysuru and Indian Institute of Technology Guwahati. So combinedly, both the institute work together to float this international webinar. This particular topic, that is field hydrology, as water is one of the most important aspects all over the world, and since mankind is behind extracting water at various levels and all, the field of hydrological sciences also has grown considerably. However, in the recent years, the emphasis on the field hydrology is getting reduced. To overcome or to make people aware of such the importance of field hydrology, this webinar has come into picture, or it has been activated. So I welcome all the people. So let me first welcome Professor Yadupati Putti and Professor Subhashish Datta, who have organized this particular thing. I will briefly describe about them. Along with that, we have Professor Rohini Nagapadma from Principal of National Institute of Engineers Mysuru, and now Professor T.G. Sitaram, Director of Indian Institute of Technology. He has also joined this session. So I welcome all the delegates, these important dignitaries, into this session. I also welcome Professor Subhashish, Professor Chandan Manda, Head of the Department of Civil Engineering. Then we have an important lecture by an eminent speaker, Professor McDonald. So he's there all the way from Canada. He will be attending this particular lecture. Now, as part of this session, I will just request Professor Yadupati to briefly introduce about this. Yes. So we will briefly introduce about the session. Before introducing about this particular webinar, there is a small lighting session which our student community from IIT Guwahati have organized that. So we will just show the lighting session, and Professor Yadupati Putti will then subsequently brief about this webinar. Yeah, so Professor Yadupati Putti, he is also one of the organizer, and he is from National NIE Mysuru. I just request him to kindly deliver, brief about the motivation of this webinar and all.
Namaskar to all. I hope I am being heard. Shall I continue? Yes. Namaskaras.
Yes. We can hear you.
Namaskaras to all. I am supposed to tell about the motivation behind this mega event, which we call the workshop on field hydrology. Personally, for me, the motivation undoubtedly is the diversity of this creation and the beauty of the land of Western Ghats, which we call with love the Sahyadris in Karnataka. It is the never diluting love for mountains, the love for forests and waters of this land that drives me to the field. The great Indian thought that learning is for personal gain. It is for Atmonati, we call in Samskrita, the self-assent, which induces love to work on field. The compulsions of the profession that we are in, the teaching profession, make me motivate my colleagues and students to join me in my endeavors. The need for generating student projects year after year forces us to write proposals for research fund. The so obtained funds, especially from ISRO, TechKeep and MOES here at NA, have made us set up experimental watersheds in the Western Ghats. People in the remote villages there help us no end. Our friends in institutions like Indian Institute of Science, the NITs, keep encouraging us and our college supports us. The series of workshops that we organized during the last 1 decade has built up confidence in us and forces us to do more. It's on the other side that I talk now. On the other side, the pandemic has given a new dimension to cooperation in the field of education the world over. While the internet made this world a global village, the pandemic, fortunately or unfortunately, has made this globe a global institution. We were no fools to let this opportunity go a waste. Professor Datta, Professor Shekhar and Professor Jeffrey from far off Canada came forward to join us once we called upon them to do. The emails helped us to rope in a variety of hydrologists. Everyone accepted to join our efforts, never ever asking for the benefits that would be that we would have from such a event. Not a paisa has since been spent, and there has never been a need for seeking funds. Nobody has been asked to give us funds. It has all been sheer pleasure and passion. It's just a huge effort from every member of the team to give out the best and to provide the water community with something unique and highly creative. We fervently hope we succeed in our attempt. It is just a belief. It is just a hope that we support the cause of field hydrology, which is being called as a dying art these days. As Professor mentions in his paper, Professor Jeffrey has often told that it's a dying art and we have to do something. And our efforts are towards that end. I welcome to all for this particular inaugural function and then for the 5-day sessions. Welcome again from the board of NIE. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Putti. So I think mask is creating voice noise. This thing. So thank you, Professor Putti, for the well-addressed motivation behind this webinar. I would also like to introduce you to host the entire audience. So Professor Yedupati Putti is a professor at the Department of Civil Engineering, National Institute of Engineering, Mysuru. He has extensively worked in the field on rainfall and runoff processes in the Western Ghats. He has been instrumental in setting up experimental watersheds and field hydrological laboratories in remote areas of Kodagu. Professor Putti has carried out several studies on urban tanks, river diversions, water disputes, micro hydro and landslides in the Western Ghats. He has guided PhD students as well as MTech projects and all. Professor Putti has handled several projects as well, and he is also found in extracurricular activities, especially in literature and all. So thank you, Professor Putti, in addressing the entire community about the motivation on this webinar. Now, I request Professor, our chief guest for this session, Professor Rohini Nagapatma, Principal NIE, to briefly address this audience.
Namaste everyone.
Namaste.
It is a pleasure to be invited to this inauguration program that will commence this week-long international workshop. I send greetings from the National Institute of Engineering, Mysore, to Professor Dr. T.G. Sitaram, Director, IIT Guwahati. I also send greetings to the esteemed speakers from inside India and also abroad. The National Institute of Engineering is one of the oldest private engineering colleges of the country and was started in the year 1946. It is run under the granted Government of Karnataka, Visvesvaraya Technical University, shortly called as VT. We at our institute have a number of centers of excellence to foster research and consultancy activities. Water Resources Group is one such center of excellence, which is also supporting the master's degree in hydraulics and water resources. This master's degree was started in the 1970s and has acted as an anchor for the research activities of the Water Resources Group. The hallmark of this research group has been their field work. The research is felicitated by the experimental watersheds in the hills of Western Ghats. One more contribution of this group is setting up of a field hydrological laboratory that caters to training of master's students. I am happy that their field experience has motivated the coordinators to organize this webinar in association with some of the leading institutions in the country and abroad. In this context, I wish all the success to this workshop, and I'm sure it will benefit the people immensely. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Professor Nagapadma. It's a very thoughtful information you have provided to all of us as well as the audience and all. So we also thank you for supporting, means that is since you are heading NIE, means you have given the full support in conducting this workshop and all. We thank you very much on that aspect. Now I would request our guest of honor, Professor T.G. Sitaram. He is a director of IIT Guwahati, and he is a profound researcher as well as he has been working on the geotechnical aspects for last many years. So he is also chair professor, and he is also the chairman of the AICT in the Southwestern Zonal Committee. He is also president of International Association for Coastal Reservoir Research, which are relevant in these aspects and all. He is also honorary professor at University of Wollongong. So I request Professor, just briefing only, I am sure that this is a brief introduction only about you. However, for the brevity, we just request you to address the attendees here and share your thoughts on that.
Namaskara to everyone. Very good evening to all of you. It gives me great pleasure to be here with all of you on the international workshop on the joy. See, that's a very beautiful word. On the joy, opportunities and challenges in the field of hydrological research. I'm happy that IIT Guwahati is also co-hosting this event with the National Institute of Engineering at Mysore. Professor Datta, Dr. Rohini Nagpadma, and Professor Suresh Karta and many others who are here today. Thank you for inviting me to say a few words on this day of the sort of inauguration of the international workshop on the joy, opportunities and challenges in the field of hydrological research. Water, you see, water is one topic, even though I don't directly work in water, but I told you in geotechnology, my interest is trying to put together the solutions for solving the issues on water problem. As Karta was highlighting to you, we have created a completely out of the box idea looking at downstream water management of a river. See, we are, as you all know, that we are the largest dam building nation, third largest dam building nation in the world. See, India has built almost 5,700 large dams. And we are still building. We are the only country, I think, we are still building. And where, unfortunately, where the event is happening, the hosting, that is in the Northeast. 300 odd dams, large dams we are building in the Northeast. Water is one of the most important natural resources, without which there would be no life on Earth. The supply of water available for our use is limited by nature. That's what you're all hearing from all experts all over the world, including World Bank, and there is a plenty. They're saying the potable water is very, very small quantity. We have to use it very carefully. But ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you, there is plenty of water on Earth. And I would like to say, quote Mahatma Gandhi here, the world has enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. This is a fantastic statement. Mahatma Gandhi said it very long back, but we haven't really even understood that. We are simply quoting the Western media. I will tell you, a country like India with 1,300 millimeter average annual rainfall, there cannot be what is called a shortage. Why this issue of shortage is coming? Because as I told you, although there is a plenty of water on Earth, it is not always in the right place, at the right time, and the right quality. Adding to this problem, there is an increasing evidence that chemical waste from industrial waste and improperly discarded yesterday waste are showing up in our water supplies today and making the water non-potable, non-usable. As I told you, hydrology is a very important science in civil engineering. Hydrology has evolved as a science in response to the need to understand the complex water systems on the earth and help solve water problems. Hydrologists play a vital role in finding solutions to water problems, and interesting and challenging careers are available to those who are doing this. But however, what has happened over a period of time that we are working in isolation and in silos. There is so much of technology in civil engineering which has emerged where hydrologists also to embrace, to conserve water. So this conservation of water should happen in a very big way. Otherwise, will be actually no way. If you want to really make India a 5 trillion economy, first of all, we have to give water to every individual in every 6 lakh villages of the country. How much of water we are consuming for agriculture? We are almost 82% of the water we are using in agriculture sector. Our domestic utilization is only 8 to 10%. Our industrial is another 8 to 10%. Okay, which makes up the 100%. Unfortunately, we need to teach our farmers how to consume water intelligently. Instead, what we are trying to borrow from Israel is the desalination technique, which is ridiculous, utter ridiculous. See, we are allowing surplus, beautiful rainwater, which falls in the same Western Ghats, okay, and allow that to join the ocean and go into the ocean and take it back and clean it up and supply at a very high cost for the people. I think this needs to stop. This needs to stop. I'm using very loud words, but it is a very passionate. I'm very passionate about this water because I have seen city of Mangalore. People who are working in that area knows that trying to use the desalination technique, which is utter ridiculous. when such large quantity of fresh water, because please understand the Western Ghats, the rivers are only 100 kilometers long. And that too, out of that, 50% of that will be flowing at with a very high gradient steep slopes of the Western Ghats. Once it reaches, there is not much of industry as well. Okay, slowly it is coming up only in isolated pockets of Mangalore and other areas, but otherwise throughout the Western Ghats, starting from Mumbai, Maharashtra to Kerala, there are so many rivers. Unfortunately, all that water we are allowing it to the ocean and then take it back through desalination and popularizing. Instead, we need to learn how to effectively use the water buffer irrigation from Israelis. Israelis are experts of drip irrigation, all that. But unfortunately, we are learning from them how to use the desalination. Israel is a country with a very few average rainfall. Average rainfall is very poor there. Rainfall is very poor. But India is rich of water. So what I would like to say, coming from geotechnical engineering, I'll tell you, geotechnical engineering and hydrology has a lot of commonalities. Why do I say that? See, even geotechnical engineers solve the problem of environmental protection, preventing or cleaning up pollution, locating sites and safe disposal of waste. All that is also a topic for geotechnical engineering as well. Okay, so geotechnical engineering includes the investigation and engineering evaluation of earth materials, including soil, rock, groundwater. Watch that. Groundwater and man-made materials and their interaction with earth retention systems. Unless you understand geotechnical engineering and the developments in geotechnical engineering, is very difficult to solve the water issue problems. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not exaggerating. Why? Because in anything in civil engineering has changed the way we work is in geotechnical engineering using geosynthetic materials. See, how many years back we have invented a new material in civil engineering? It's only in geosynthetics. See, our concrete is no more a material which is going to be forever. Please understand, life of the concrete is about maybe 50 to 100 years. So we have built many large dams using concrete. Unfortunately, most of them are leaking. Almost 30 to 40% of them are leaking. So we have taken up a big project through World Bank, spending lots of money to seal off those, leakages. But how many days you can continue that? Why? Because what I'm talking about, by 2150, if you go by 2150 in the world, most of the large dams in concrete construction, we have to remove them. We might, please look at this. This is done with a very scientific calculations. By 2150, most of the large dams, we have to remove them. America has already removed hundreds of large dams on the rivers, because repairing them, it's like putting a stent into your body. Okay, so you had an heart attack, you put a stent into your body, you can increase by another 10 years. You cannot live forever. So we need to look at the new materials, and we know that earth materials are sustainable and long term. And the dams which were constructed almost 200, 300 years back still survives. Why 200, 300? 1,000 years back, Kallanani and Ekat. You know that. Across Kaveri, in outskirts of Trichy. I don't know how many of you have seen it. Please go and see that. This is done completely in granite. Okay, Kallanani Anikat is one of the Anikat which was built by Rajaraja Chola 1,000 years back, which still survives. Okay, so I want people to think about coming together. Alone we can do so very little. I will just like to quote Helen Keller here. Quotes, alone we can do so little, together we can do so much. So civil engineering has actually, I'm very sorry to say, bifurcated into many streams. Unless we come together, work together. Otherwise, civil engineering programs in India are actually nowhere in the ranking as well. If you look at even IIT Guwahati is nowhere in the picture, because our faculty is not that they are not doing well. Because I'll tell you, just 2 days back, there is a release by the top 2% scientists who are working, how many publications they have done based on that. So they could not even clearly identify civil engineering topics, geotechnology, geotechnical engineering, water resources. No, they are putting geotechnology and geographic something. Very ridiculous. So what I'm trying to say is we need to come together as civil engineers and we have to build the nation. And without this, without water, we can go much further. With these few words, as I told you very clearly, that we need to come together, work together, and hydrology is a very important topic. I wish this international workshop on the field of hydrological research, great, I think you will learn a lot of things through the deliberations, through experts from both Canada, and it's very nice to see a Canada name because, as I told you, Canada is one country which is having a surplus freshwater. Surplus, and that's the only country I think can boast of a lot of storage. So I would like to end my speech with a punchline. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no shortage of water. Don't be scared with all these statistics, what all the World Bank and United Nations gives you. What is shortage is storage. Intelligent storage in the ground, intelligent storage in the underground reservoirs, intelligent storage in coastal reservoirs, because there is no more in large dams. So storage is the solution because 80% or 85% of water through our rivers running out to the ocean. 85%, not just small. We are only storing less than 10% of the rainfall, annual rainfall received in our large dams, are close to about 6,000 dams. You can now understand the realistic problem. And we need to work together to solve the problems locally. And as I told you, local for global. So we need to bring out the local technologies and which we are very rich. Indian knowledge system, if you go back, India knew that we need to store water because we have only 3 to 4 months of monsoon rainfall. Another 8 months we need to survive. How do we survive? We need to store water locally in smaller reservoirs, not very large dams. Okay, and we need to conserve this water unless this water, because water is precious to all of us. So I hope the workshop will deliberate on larger issues rather than again focusing on very narrow areas of hydrology. Think little big and try to look at the entire the world. We have a solution for the world because large amount of water is running out and we don't need to be scared of the words what others say. We need to think out of the box and try to come up with innovative technical solutions for conserving water. With these few words, I again thank everyone and I wish the workshop a great success. Thank you very much. Good day. Thank you. Namaskar.
Thank you, Professor Sitaram, for providing such a wonderful and enlightening aspects of water, and especially all the attendees who might have now known that water is not a deficient, it is the storage. It is the storage that is deficient in our country. I thank you once again. Now I request Professor Subhashish Datta to briefly address his views on how how he came in arranging this particular webinar series and all. So, Professor Datta.
Professor Datta, you are muted. Please unmute yourself.
Good evening, all of you, for these webinars. And honorable directors, Professor T.J. Sitaram, the honorable principals, Dr. Rohini Nagapadma, National Institute of Engineering, Mysore, the co-conveners, the professors Vadipi Bhuti, Professor Chandan Mahanta, head of the Department of Civil Engineers, IIT Guwahati. Distinguished professors and keynote speakers who is going to join certainly shortly, Professor Jerif MacDonald, University of Sussex, Canada. My colleagues, the students and the research scholars from IIT Guwahati, participants from India and also the abroad, as we have very close to 400 participants, not only from India, also some of the participants from Bangladesh, in other part of the world. So in this, I welcome to these webinars for 5 days webinars under this COVID-19 periods. Look at this, the titles of the seminars talk about the joy, opportunities, challenges in the field hydrological research. So that's what I started my careers with the field hydrology research way back almost 15 to 17 years back. I have gone through all these challenges what is faced at different periods when you want to prove yourself as a field hydrologist. Okay, look at the field level of studies. So I just want to share my thoughts. What I have a very interesting and challenging and challenge I got it when I conducted 2 surveys. One of the survey I conducted in Tawang Chu, which is having an altitude about 2,200 meters above the mean sea levels. And if you look at that rivers, which is width of the hull, it's 30 meters width, and we planned with all these advanced equipments just to measure the discharge, and as well as other ecological parameters. But whenever we reach to that spot of the rivers, we used to track it almost 2 to 3 kilometers. And once you track and reach that locations, which is in Arunachal Pradesh, after reaching the spot, we found it that the velocity is so high that we cannot use any advanced equipment to measure even the velocity or the flow depth. Not only that, we cannot cross to the other side of the bank. Other side of bank, if you want to go it, you have to track more than 15 kilometers. It could take another 10 hours to reach that other side of the river. So if you look at the challenging task, what you will get it when you do any upland, Himalayan regions, even if to measure the discharge, it really challenging tasks. If you look at that way, but what we observe, okay, we measure some discharge, but we observe the landscape, the ecology, which is closely to pristine ecologies. You can see the trees of more than 500 years old. So if you look at that concept, that's what gives us a joy to us, apart from doing the hydrological study. The same way, if I narrate it, another event what we did it, conducting the river survey in Brahmaputra rivers, which its width is more than 10 kilometer width. When you have the 10 kilometer width of the rivers, even if you go with advanced equipments like river survey vessels, velocity meters, and all these things are with the DGPS and all the things, but it was not so easy to do the survey. It took more than 5 hours just to transect one survey line. So if you look at that, as a field researchers, many times you become frustrated, it is a challenge to them. But still I remember when you were crossing doing these river surveys in Brahmaputra rivers, we saw is very memorable the view of the wild elephants had, which we cannot see anywhere else. having more than 100 elephants, wild elephant, you can see their activities and all. So what I'm to say is, I'm sharing the both. There is a difficulties in the hydrology. So that's the reasons many of hydrologists, they say it, the hydrology is not neither too easy nor too complex. Neither is too stochastic, nor it's just a deterministic things. All these things, the doubts what we have, conducting the few experiment or as a field hydrologist, we can take a judgment where you land it, whether the stochastics or deterministics or easy or the complex. So that's where my lessons learned, and many of these untold stories, I do hope it. Many are Professor McDonald's, Professor Sekhar Muddu from IIC Bangalore, Professor Oti, Professor Nandi, all they will share it, the conducting this field hydrology, how difficult it is, and how we can make it really joy and opportunities when you do the hydrology at the field scales. That's the reasons. My point is that in these COVID-19 pandemic periods, we have been arranging these programs to give you this interesting feeling about the field hydrology. No doubt, when you do the hydrology, we don't look at only the water components. We look at sediment cycles, we look at the nutrient cycles, we look at the ecological concept, or we look at under the umbrella of hydrology. Hydrology doesn't confine it only these water components. That's what we'll have a more debate about this when next few days. Really, we'll have a lot of debates. And I just encourage the participants, please chat with us, and we'll try to give appropriate answers or the share the difficulties or challenges what we face it when you do the field level research studies. With these few notes, I just want to thank all of you for attending this webinars. Having the registrations is more than 400, and so that way it really gives encourage us to look at the hydrologies beyond the waters, and I do hope it will do our level best to make these webinars as a successful stories for us. Thank you all, and very good evening. Again, I can say it for my sides. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor Datta.
By the way, Professor Jeffrey is here. If you welcome him and introduce ourselves to Professor Jeffrey.
Yeah. So Professor Jeffrey has joined the session, and most welcome Professor Jeffrey McDonald to this session. So we are through our we are on the inaugural session of that. You might have got the schedule of that day's event. So we are running little bit behind actually. However, we'll cover as soon as possible. So we are all waiting for your lecture actually. So before that, let me express vote of thanks to all the attendees and whoever have contributed to this webinar, this thing and all. So I'll just briefly. So first, let me convey thanks to Almighty God in giving us this opportunity to come together for this webinar, despite the entire world struggling with the pandemic. I thank Professor Rohini Nagapatma, Principal and Chief Guest of this inaugural session, in providing thoughtful remarks as well as providing support to this program. I thank Professor T.G. Sitaram, Director of IIT Guwahati, for kindly gracing this session as guest of honor, and his thoughts are very much relevant in field hydrology as well as a water resource engineer and all. It is highly thought-provoking also, whatever he has mentioned about the storage of water. I thank Professor Yadupati Putti and Professor Subhashish Datta in organizing this conference meticulously with all up-to-date details. I also thank both of them in giving me this opportunity to speak in front of you all. I thank Professor Chandan Mahanta Head Department of Civil Engineering, in providing all logistics for conducting this conference, as well as providing thoughtful remarks. I also thank Professor McDonald in kindly agreeing to deliver the keynote inaugural lecture on the first day of this webinar series. We are all waiting for your lecture, Professor McDonald. Then I also thank all other eminent speakers who will be delivering lectures on subsequent days of this conference. Also thanking the organizers from NIE as well as IIT Guwahati, who all have dedicatedly planned the sessions as well as structured the program neatly. Special thanks to Professor Yusuf Javed, Professor K.C. Manjunath, Mr. Anand Hulagabadi, Dr. Puneet Kotagi from NIE, and Anjaneyulu, Ashish Banerjee, Ketan, Suman Padi, Suresh Modalavalsa, and all. And if I have missed anyone else's name, kindly excuse me, all from IIT Guwahati, because all of them have worked immensely in organizing this webinar series. I also thank all the participants who have registered or watching live the sessions of this webinar. It is amazing that we have participants from wide range of fields and from different regions, both from the governmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, as well as field engineers, as well as academicians. So thank you all for showing spirit to learn, as well as dedicating time for this conference. With that, I just like to end this inaugural session, and we can have maybe you require 1 minute break, or will direct. So I will now request Professor Chandan Mahanta. Professor Chandan Mahanta is the head of the Department of Civil Engineering. So he is an eminent fellow in the field of hydrology. He has been in several, apart from that, he has been in several committees for the government of Assam as well as government of India. He has visited several countries as well as he has been chair professor also. I request Professor Mahanta to kindly moderate the session of this inaugural lecture by Professor Jeffrey McDonald. So Professor Mahanta, please address our attendees.
Thank you, Professor Kartha. It's so very inspiring to join all of you. Our Honorable Director, Professor Sitaram, then Madam Rohini, Professor Jadupati, of course, my esteemed colleague, Professor Datta, and all others. And so very especially Professor Jeffrey McDonald from all the way from Canada. It's my honor and privilege, Professor McDonald, to welcome you to this session. And I have been reading some of your papers, probably the 2015 papers, weather field hydrology. That's a very interesting engagement. I think we're going to highlight more on that. And of course, this workshop on joy, opportunities, and challenges in field hydrological research. I would like to underscore, as our Honorable Director, being a very passionate hydrologist, has been highlighting that, you know, the joy of hydrology itself, and also the field hydrology in particular. I'm sure that's what we are all echoing you. We are, you know, very close to the Himalayas, and we are pristine Himalayas, and we are very close to the most complex braided river of the world, the Brahmaputra. But many of our students spend their entire masters and PhD, sometimes not even going and touching the water of Brahmaputra or the springs and the streams of Himalaya. So this is something, I guess, I'm sure you're going to inspire us a lot, that with more and more software, with more and more equipment, with more and more laboratory staff, we are perhaps cutting ourselves out from the real hydrology in the field. And this is something I think we have to really highlight, that we need to get back there. A little while before, our Professor Sitaram highlighted that how India has so much of fresh water, but we are trying to harness water from the sea by desalinization, rather than, you know, storing this water where they fall. 400 billion cubic meter of rainfall, that is something really enormous. So want us to understand that how really we do hydrology in this new era, with a lot of advent of equipment, with our drone and with all the things, but how we cannot still miss out on the essence of field hydrology. So this workshop really brings a new dimension in the sense that we had been all along, doing a lot of field hydrology here. My colleague, Professor Datta, Professor Suresh in particular, both are so much into water. One is into groundwater, one is surface water, but then we work water as an interdisciplinary area. And we see a lot of opportunity now to kind of, inspire us more into what we are doing and inspire us more to go beyond. Right now, we have got a couple of very prestigious and very highly funded projects on glaciers, and we intend to go to the real freshwater source, the third pole, and just below the water tower of Asia, where 6 of the mega rivers of the world originate, and all these freshwater contained there, which actually the headwater hydrology. Unfortunately, we have not been doing much of watershed science, so to say. We are not trying to understand our watershed, but we're trying to do a lot of things in the down valley, downstream, without really understanding the true hydrology. And we're making a lot of mistakes. So I guess we need to really combine our advancement in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all this stuff. At the same time, we have to always make our hands dirty, always wash our hands in the fresh water. So with that context, my privilege again to introduce today's speaker, Professor Jeffrey McDonnell. His CV has been already circulated and is a very well-known person. Everybody knows about him. But it's my honor to kind of briefly introduce him. Professor Jeffrey McDonnell is Professor of Hydrology and Associate Director of the Global Institute for Water Security at the University of Saskatchewan. Before returning to Canada in 2012, he was the Richardson Chair in Watershed Science at Oregon State University and University of Distinguished Professor. Over the past 30 years, McDonnell's work has focused on field-based runoff process description around the world, leading to new measurement techniques and new understanding of the dominant controls of rainfall runoff behavior. This is one area, Professor McDonnell, we want that you should someday come over to IIT Guwahati, and probably we all can go to the Himalayas and learn from your Canadian experience and how really we deal with watershed of such fresh, pristine water. Professor has authored about more than 300 papers and co-edited Elsevier text isotope tracers in catchment hydrology. We are going to work on a isotope hydrology on our all glaciological research there. And he has really written a very inspiring book. I was just looking at the title, Navigating an Academic Career, a brief guide for PhD students, for postdocs, and for early career faculty. I guess this is another topic, Professor McDonnell, have to speak separately to our graduate students someday to inspire them out of your book as well as your vast experience. So in recognition of his work, he received in 2016 the International Hydrology Prize from International Association of Hydrological, UNESCO, and the World Meteorological Organization. He is an elected fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, which is Canada's National Academy of Science. He is fellow of the American Geophysical Union and fellow of the Geological Society of America. He has received the Dalton Medal from the European Geophysical Union, the Birdsell Race Distinguished Lecture Award from the Geological Society of America, and the Gordon Werwick Medal from the British Society for Geomorphology, among many other honors. Beyond his science, McDonnell has served as president of the AGU Hydrology Section and served as president of the IAHS International Commission on Tracers. He is currently visiting chair on water science at the University of Birmingham and distinguished visiting professor at Tsinghua University, Beijing Forestry University, and Liudong University in China, where his focus is on early career mentoring. He has a very vast experience. I'm not going to really get into that, but honestly, Professor McDonnell, we see a lot of echoing of our work here, and hopefully, apart from enlightening us with your lecture, I think we have much more greater deal to work upon together. Particularly, isotope hydrology is another area where we're really looking forward to. And I hope today's talk is just the beginning for a very long drawn partnership and collaboration. Thank you for joining us, and we eagerly wait to listen to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for those kind words and introductions. If you can hear me, I'll try and share my desktop and show you my presentation here. And can you hear me okay?
You are perfectly audible. Thank you.
Very much.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
Very well audible. Professor?
Yep. Are you still there?
Yes, yes. Start presenting. You are well audible.
Okay, I'm just pulling up my first slide. I'm hoping you'll see it. And can you see that okay?
It has come perfectly. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And it's such a pleasure to be with you. And I hope that in the future we can be together physically. And again, thank you so much for those kind words. I'm also remembering Mike Bonnell at this time, who worked a lot in the Western Ghats. He was with UNESCO in Paris and sadly passed away a few years ago. But I'm sure some of you worked with Mike on and off over the years. But for the next 1 hour or so, I think I've been asked to speak for 60 minutes. I'd like to give you this, what I'm calling the shortest history of hill slope hydrology from a field-based perspective. So when I think of field work in hill slope hydrology, it's just as we were hearing, it's discovery science. It's this kind of activity where we're looking at flow paths and movement of water to the stream. But this is on the significant decline in our field, this kind of exploration activity in our science of hydrology. And this is the paper that was just mentioned, Tim Burt and I wrote a few years ago. And if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, on the y-axis is percentage of published papers, and on the x-axis is time. And what it's showing is the rapid increase in model-based papers and the decline in field-based papers. And I think the reasons for this are many-fold. It's difficult to do field work. It's expensive. In our culture of rewarding papers and publications, it's not as easy to forge a CV in early career based on these kind of field activities. And this is something I hope we can counter, and this is a wonderful event to do that. So what I'd like to do is cover a number of things in our field that have occurred since 1933, and I'll tell you why that date was chosen in a minute. And we'll talk about how things have evolved in terms of our field-based mechanistic understanding of hill slope hydrology, some of the key studies and concepts, the methods used, and why field work is so important. And I'm kind of motivating this by a book I read last year while I was on sabbatical in Europe for 2019. It was based in Luxembourg, and this shortest history of Europe, I found a very compelling way to tell the story of European history. And what I'm hoping to do is tell you the story of hill slope hydrology in a similar, highly condensed way. So what's our challenge? Well, what we're trying to do is take the hydrograph, the stream hydrograph, like you saw in the materials leading up to today's talk, the videos and animations, and we're trying to understand the contributions of rainfall events, for instance, or maybe it's glacial melt in the high Himalayas, to the stream hydrograph that we see here in the bottom left and bottom right. And we're interested in this both in terms of the time components, but also the spatial components. Where does the water come from? So our questions then are runoff source, flow paths, and travel times. These are really the three essential questions in hill slope hydrology, catchment hydrology, and understanding our headwaters. And our scale today, and for much of our inquiry, is at the hill slope scale. So we're interested in large drainage basins, but what are those composed of? Large drainage basins really are composed of many, many headwater catchments, and the headwaters, really the defining landscape scale, is the hill slope. This is the grain of the landscape. This is where rainfall is transformed into infiltration or overland flow or other pathways to the stream. And there's a great quote in a paper by Siva Palan back in 2003, just about the nature of field activity. And I think this is worth quoting from. In order to arrive at satisfactory simplicity, we need to whittle down the unnecessary process details and transfer the dominant process control from the hill slope to the watershed scale. So what I'm hoping today is to help with that whittling down process and showing how we've whittled down as a community our ideas in hill slope hydrology over the last many decades. So you can think of this short lecture this morning or today as really a short synthesis of hill slope hydrology, but it's also really trying to capture rainfall runoff processes, catchment hydrology, stream flow generation, and some of the other terms you see here. So hopefully some of you in the audience will find a docking port to some of these words and these concepts and ideas. So we're going to our catchments, our streams, like your stream here and the materials we saw earlier, and we're trying to understand where does the water come from, what's the flow path to the stream, and how long does it take to get there. And to do that, really, the last almost 100 years or so can, I think, be broken down into these three main periods. The first starting with Horton's work in 1933, and then the first international hydrological decade that started in 1965. This is when about 9,000 small catchments were gauged around the world and really ushered in intense field work in our community. And then a new tool in our field activities, the introduction of stable isotopes about the mid-1970s or so. These are the periods I'm going to focus on as I try to tell this story. And we'll start with Horton, 1933, or Horton's work in general. And the question is, why start there? And this is a lovely quote from Keith Bevan. Robert Horton was not the first scientific hydrologist interested in hill slope runoff processes, but he was certainly the most important of the 20th century. And we start here with Horton because he was an engineer, but very much aware of the need to characterize these processes going on associated with runoff generation. This is a picture from a paper in 1939 that he published, and his understanding conceptually of overland flow. So there's some initial detention of water. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but you see initial detention of water and then lateral flow beginning with loss into the soil profile occurring even during that overland flow. This work was really, well, of course, gave us now this concept of infiltration overland flow, like you see in the cartoon on the right, where the rain intensity exceeds the soil infiltrability. But this was really based on process work at his field site in upstate New York. This is some of his handwriting from a series of boxes that Keith Bevan has uncovered in the National Archives in the United States. Again, this is Horton's writing. You see infiltration capacity on the y-axis, and that would be time on the x-axis. And he's showing a square wave of rainfall, and then the decrease in infiltrability through the rainfall due to colloidal packing and movement, and then coming to a stable, in that middle part of the diagram there, infiltration rate, and then after the event, a rebounding of infiltration capacity. So his work was very field-based and led to the equation you see there, this famous Horton infiltration equation. And this was adopted by engineers for many decades and is probably still the basis for many of our engineering models. And here you're looking at infiltration and rainfall on the y-axis. Again, rain along the top. And you see now this decrease in rainfall infiltration, increase in runoff. Note the gap or the threshold in terms of the onset of runoff. And we'll talk about those thresholds in a little bit, but also note that the runoff is not getting up to touch the rainfall. And that's because that is the loss along the profile during the runoff event as water continues to infiltrate into the soil, even during overland flow. Now let's just look at this overland flow. One of the things that hydrologists some decades after Horton were realizing was that while you can see infiltration excess overland flow in certain disturbed landscapes like this playing field area, it wasn't everywhere. And this paper by Betson in 1964 was quite important because he recognized that there were these hot spots, what he called partial areas. And this is a diagram of it here. So this is the idea that these areas of overland flow were really restricted to certain parts of the watershed that maybe had been disturbed, and these were the zones producing overland flow. So this took the idea of overland flow everywhere to really overland flow only on certain areas of the watershed. And this is quite important, and this is where we were as a community leading up to the first international hydrological decade. And Keith Bevan has a paper that's just come out in Hess, Hydrology and Earth System Science, and he calls this the era of infiltration. This period from about 1933 till about 1964 as the era of infiltration. And in fact, hydrologists of the day noted that. Here's a quote from Howard Cook, who worked for U.S. Department of Agriculture in the United States, saying, "Some future historian of the development of scientific hydrology will probably be tempted to call the present period the era of infiltration. At any rate, the preoccupation of contemporary hydrologists with the infiltration theory of runoff and the vast amount of energy that they have expended in an effort to turn this concept into practical account will certainly be put down as a distinctive feature of our times." And I would say that's really true for that period of 1933 to 65 or thereabouts. I think what happened was that with the introduction of the first international hydrological decade, and going to these many watersheds around the world in different kinds of climate and geomorphological settings, really it changed from an era of infiltration to an era of subsurface flow. This decade was very important in Canada. We had a stamp devoted to it. I'm sure there were celebrations in India and all around the world. But again, this went for a decade and resulted in gauging of many, many basins, rainfall runoff mostly. And we used this to understand runoff processes from field measurements. One of the most important areas initially was in the United States at the Coweta Hydrologic Lab. This is in North Carolina, and what you see immediately is, like in the Western Ghats, it's forested, and it's a very steep forested wet environment. And here's a quote from an important paper just into that first international hydrological decade by Hewlett and Hibbert. And they're saying, usually a discussion of runoff from a watershed begins with the assumption that direct runoff is a product of overland flow, and that other types of flow are mere exceptions to the rule. Perhaps the opposite approach is more logical in the case of forest land, that is, to begin with the assumption that all flow is subsurface unless there's evidence otherwise. This is really a paradigm shift in our field that occurred with this work. This is saying that, well, I don't see overland flow anywhere when I go and do my field work. It all seems to go into the ground, and this must be what's delivering flow to the stream. Here's the paper, the 1967 paper. Hewlett was really the consummate field scientist. He did many things in addition to making measurements, he installed artificial models in the field. This is basically a cement aquiclude filled with soil where he did experiments. But this paper was quite important because it ushered in something called the variable source area concept that we still think of today. So here's his diagram of a hill slope on the right-hand side. In plan view, on the left-hand side, you see the stream network, and those arrows are the expanded soil, and he's trying to understand from these field measurements how runoff is being produced in the subsurface where there's no overland flow to be seen. And he's calling this, or he's saying about this, a better description of this phase of runoff is to say when subsurface flow of water from upslope exceeds the capacity of the soil profile to transmit it, the water will come to the surface and the channel length will grow. This, in essence, is the variable source area concept. So this is really changing the thinking from this field work at this site to a very different conceptual model or perceptual model of how runoff is being generated, and shifting from this overland flow to subsurface flow concept based on these measurements. This variable source area concept then really is now the umbrella to describe runoff, whether it's the partial area that we talked about, and we're not going to refer to anymore, but these other two pieces of the variable source area concept, saturation overland flow and subsurface storm flow. Let's first look at this piece, the saturation overland flow. This is when, remember the quote, when the soil is not able to transmit the upslope flow anymore, water tables come to the surface. This is the piece we're going to talk about in the lower slope. And this was a very important paper during this international hydrological decade by Dunn and Black in 1970, focused on this saturation overland flow. They did field investigations in Vermont, this is in the Northeast United States, and their field approach was trenching. So this kind of gray hatched piece is about a 300-foot trench that they excavated at the base of a slope. And they really identified clearly this saturation overland flow mechanism, where now on the cartoon on the right-hand side, overland flow is being produced, but not due to increased rain intensity over infiltrability, due to the fact that the water table is risen from below to get to the soil surface and produce saturated areas around the foot slopes. So this work led to really a concept of this saturated area, like you can see here in the photograph during snowmelt. This saturated area expands and contracts during an event or between events or seasonally. And as you can see in the cartoon on the left, as the saturated area grows, it's really a key partitioning zone for water to get quickly into the stream channel. And you see the nature of the hydrograph response associated with this growing and contracting saturated area. Now, these saturated areas, they are a key part of this understanding of runoff generation under the variable source area concept. But they're driven by subsurface flow that's coming from upslope to produce those saturated zones. And we're going to talk about that for a minute. And when we think about saturation overland flow versus subsurface flow, the big difference is that one you can see and one you can't see. So for saturation overland flow, if we go to a catchment in Switzerland, here you can see I'm outlining in red this saturated area. And if you go with your shovel and dig into it, you can see the soils are gleyed, grayish, waterlogged soils. You see the vegetation's a bit different in that near stream area. You can see that zone. You can measure with your squishy boots whether or not it's expanding or contracting. For subsurface storm flow, it's different. It's largely invisible to the naked eye. And this is probably true in the Western Ghats and some of your other steeper, wetter areas. This is an example from the Northwest United States at the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest, but it's producing rapid runoff in the streams, but the boundary conditions, unlike saturation overland flow, are largely hidden to us. And this is where fieldwork is so important. Now, the first work to try to help with field studies to understand the nature of this hidden subsurface storm flow was right at the beginning of this first international hydrological decade. And this is from Ronald Whipke, who was a U.S. Forest Service hydrologist. And you're seeing here this technique that he, I think, first described or invented, this idea of troughs or guttering at different layers through the soil profile to understand how and where water is moving laterally through the soil to create stream flow. This was a very important paper, and he helped to demonstrate the importance of these textural interfaces, the horizons of the soil and their different hydraulic conductivity to force water moving laterally. This is something that Mike Bunnell used to call the throttles for lateral flow. The next development really was the use of recording or manually read tensiometers, these pore pressure devices, to understand the nature of subsurface flow. This is Darrell Wayman's PhD work from Bristol, and this is in the UK at East Twin Brook in the southwest United Kingdom. And here, as you can see, his hill slope, and on the right-hand side is the hill slope at different stages through the rain event, and the peak of the event is the lower plot. And he's identifying the flow paths using tensiometers. These are pore pressure measuring devices to give you an idea of, in this case, this expanding saturated wedge that's growing up the hill slope and is really dominating the processes of hill slope delivery through the subsurface to the stream. Again, field-based work that was so critical in illuminating the black box of how these hill slopes operate. This was taken further by Tim Burt in his PhD work. This is nearby in the Mendip Hills in the southwest United States. And here's Tim and myself a couple of years ago with his hill slope in the background. This is his PhD data here. You can see a stream channel and a hill slope, and you're seeing 4 instances in time. And in the bottom left is the peak hydrograph. And basically you're seeing, based on these tensiometer measurements, but now rather than a 2-dimensional cross-section, in plan view across the hill slope, you're seeing the development of saturation in the subsurface, delivering water to the stream. And again, all of this is invisible to the naked eye because it's happening in the subsurface. And the really important aspect of this work was that Tim Burt was able to identify how hill slopes connected to streams. And what he showed was that if you looked at these patches, so on the y-axis you're seeing the discharge, and on the x-axis is distance downstream, what you're seeing is that the movement of water from hill slope to streams was very irregular, and most of it's coming out in these hill slope hollows, these depressions in the landscape. They may be subtle, but they're really dominant in terms of the hotspots for water delivery to the stream. Again, not visible except with field work. Now, at the end of the first international hydrological decade, there was still doubt about these kinds of field-based processes. And this was a review done by Al Fries, who was a modeler, and he was saying what's in doubt is whether subsurface storm flow can deliver enough water to provide significant contributions to storm flow. He's saying the quantities measured by Hewlett and Whipke were small, and the authors didn't relate the outflow to the channel hydrograph. So he's quite skeptical of this whole thing of subsurface storm flow. What followed was work by Dennis Haar. This is work in Oregon in the northwest United States, probably landscapes that are looking more like your Western Ghats sites, steep, forested, wet, even some taller mountains in the background. And here, looking at a small 10-hectare watershed and with a hill slope that had a trench excavated, Haar, in this very important paper in 1977, was able to produce data for a series of 7 or 8 storms. And I only want you to look at the right-hand column. You see those percentages. Those are the percent of subsurface storm flow as a percent of quick flow. Remember, if quick flow is what was defined by Hewlett and Hibbert about 10 years earlier as if we take a hydrograph, for instance, on the left-hand side, discharge versus time, and we have this quick flow separation line. This is projecting a slope at 0.0055 liters per second per hectare per hour. This is the slope they chose. Above that is quick flow, below that is delayed flow, and we do this for forested watersheds everywhere. What Haar is saying that almost 100% of that quick flow is coming by subsurface storm flow. So this is really showing that in steep wet areas, subsurface storm flow can be really the only contributor in many instances. This was followed by work in New Zealand by Mosley. This is a paper in 1979, a very important paper. Again, a steep, wet watershed that probably looks a lot like the Western Ghats. You're seeing a small, roughly 4-hectare watershed, and again, more trenching. And what they found here was that again, subsurface storm flow was critically important, but how was it being delivered to the stream? It was through a series of soil pipes that developed roughly around the soil bedrock interface. And based on field work, these were the main zones that were delivering water quickly from these hill slopes to the stream. Not something you would ever identify in a Darcy-Richards-based hydrological model. Again, an important process defined by field work. And putting it all together, this is really the state of play at the end of the first international hydrological decade. Many of you will have seen this textbook by Kirkby that came out in '78, I think, and just showing the multitude of pathways informed by field activity over this decade. The preferential flow like we saw at Mai, the saturated wedges like we saw at the site of Darrell Wayman, and then in the hollows dominating the flow of water from hill slopes to the near stream zone. Okay, the next period, and the last period I want to talk about, is the use of stable isotopes that started to be occurring in hydrology around the end of this first international hydrological decade. The identification or discovery of isotopes of hydrogen and oxygen that make up the water molecule, this had happened earlier in the 1920s, and Nobel Prizes were given for finding the isotopes of oxygen and the isotopes of hydrogen, of course, that make up the water molecule. And we're going to talk about that. But first, I just want to make it clear that everything I've talked about so far in terms of our field-based discovery and understanding and perceptual model of hill slope hydrology has been derived from so-called hydrometric measurements. So like this, I'm showing you rainfall scrolling along the top. This is the storm hydrograph in black along the bottom. So on the y-axis is flow, and on the x-axis, this is day of year. So this is a small rainfall-dominated watershed, and this is the kind of data that we used up until the mid-1970s, whether it was for a hill slope or a catchment. Maybe we were putting tensiometers in and looking at those time series. But in each case, what we're doing is really looking at the celerity of the hydraulic potentials. So these hydrograph responses to the rain impulse are really clocking the pressure propagation through the landscape, the celerity of the hydraulic potentials. Let me give you an analogy. So take a garden hose that might be full of water in the summer, and you pick up the one end of the garden hose, and instantly water squirts out the other end, even if the garden hose is 100 feet long. That's the pressure propagation. That's the celerity of the hydraulic potentials moving through the garden hose. Isotopes are different. Here I'm showing the O18. This is the isotope of oxygen, part of the water molecule. Think of isotope tracing as a fingerprinting technique, where you can actually track raindrops moving through the hill slope or the catchment. I'm going to give a lecture on this whole technique on Friday. So today I'm just going to give a very abbreviated couple of slides to say what this is all about. But on the left-hand side, you see the input of the isotope composition of the rainfall. And on the right-hand side, you're seeing the isotope composition of the water in the stream as base flow. And what do we see? The right-hand side looks very lagged and damped. And that's because the hill slope or the catchment is acting like a filter to that input. If it was a paved surface, then the right-hand side would look identical to the left-hand side. And if it was an infinitely deep sand tank, then the right-hand side would be flat. There'd be no variability. And usually it's somewhere in between. But the key distinction is that this is now tracking the velocity of the water molecule. And this is very different to the celerity of the hydraulic potential that we've been looking at so far. So this is now giving us a way to really track the water molecule itself, looking at the particle velocity, not the celerity. And maybe back to our analogy, it'd be like taking that garden hose that's 100 feet long and now hooking it up to the side of the house and turning on the faucet. The water in the hose was probably warmed by the sun in the summertime. And when we turn the water on at the house, it's a cooler water. And what happens? Turn the water on at the faucet, again, immediately water comes out the hose, but it could take several minutes before you detect the cool water that's being sourced from the house. And that's the velocity, how long it takes the water particles to move through that hose. And the key thing is that velocity takes way, way, way longer than the celerity of the hydraulic potential. Let me give you an example of that with data. Just look at the top panel for a minute. That's the water flux, the rainfall runoff. The blue is the rainfall input. The brown is the storm runoff in the stream channel. This is covering a period of about 3 years on the x-axis. And this is a catchment that has a bit of a dry season each year, but when it gets wet, it really starts to be responsive so that when you have rainfall, the hydrograph is responding quite immediately. Now the bottom graph is the O18 of the rainfall, so it's what's carried with the rain. And now look at the brown dots. That's the stream flow isotope composition. It's very different to the sensitivity of the graph above. And this led Jim Kirshner in this very nice paper in, again, 2003 in Hydrological Processes to call this the old water paradox. This is the idea that hill slopes are storing water for months to years and then releasing it in minutes or hours to the stream. So very sensitive response for the celerity of the hydraulic potential, but now look at how lagged and damped the stream is isotopically. That's saying that most of the water coming out is water that existed in the watershed before the rain started falling. This is really another kind of big change in thinking, going from a very much a new water to an old water view of the system. Let me just see where I am here. This new water, old water, really changed our view of the system. And below this animation that's come up here is a recent paper by Scott Giesecco in Reviews of Geophysics, where he took about 100 or so of the catchment studies that have shown this, and they on average show about 75% of the hydrograph is made up of this old water. And most of these studies are showing this dominance of old water from the published literature based on this global assessment that he's done. So how can this happen? How can you get old water pumped out so quickly? Well, early work by Sklash and Vervolden in the late 1970s, shown here in this cartoon, introduced something called the groundwater ridging hypothesis. And there was some field data to suggest this, but the idea that you have a water table next to a stream with a capillary fringe above the water table, and if that capillary fringe extends to the ground surface, then you only need a small amount of water to raise the water table very quickly and to produce a mound around the stream channel that would steepen the hydraulic gradients and promote this increased gravity drainage of groundwater to the stream. This is all based on the moisture release curve. So just to remind you of the capillary fringe or tension saturated zone, if we look at this graph on the left-hand side, water contents on the y-axis, matrix potential or pressure head is on the x-axis, and this flat zone that you see along the top, that is the capillary fringe or the tension saturated zone. It's the zone with almost no storage that can hold tension or hold saturation effectively with tension. So that's a zone where basically, if it's extending to the ground surface, you can get very immediate response of the water table in this kind of mounding to pump groundwater into the stream. The problem is that when we go to many of our catchments, there's not enough old water in a discharge position to account for that volume of old water in the stream channel. So this is a problem. We don't have enough old water sitting right next to the stream channel to explain these isotope findings. So beginning after the many papers came out in the 70s and 80s, I think the field started moving to trying to explain the nature of mobilization of this old water into streams from areas beyond next to the stream, back to the hill slopes, in other words. So what I'm going to show you and end off with in the next 20 minutes or thereabouts is how we started doing field work to understand how hill slopes deliver old water to the stream. And the field work I'm going to show is mainly based on trenching. This idea that we go in with a shovel or a digger and we open up the hill slope to collect the water, as you can see in these little trenches on the bottom right-hand side. This is a site in Oregon. The top site is one of the sites we've worked in New Zealand. And, you know, some people call this Frankenstein hydrology. This is really destructive field work, but trying to understand the nature and timing of hill slope delivery of this isotopically old water that we see coming to the stream. That seems rather ubiquitous across these steep wet sites. So let's start with an example. Here's a site in Georgia in the United States. So this is in the southeast United States. And what you're seeing is the hill slope, the surface topography, and the subsurface topography. We've used various field techniques to understand what the nature of the subsurface topography is. Ground penetrating radar, a geophysical technique, and also pounding steel rods to refusal in the soil profile. This hill slope's about 20 meters by 40 meters in terms of length and width. But what you can see immediately is that the subsurface doesn't look like the surface. So water is passing through the surface profile. Again, this is a forested site and with lots of infiltrability. And what you'll see in a minute, it's backing up at that soil bedrock interface, sensing that subsurface topography. Here's our field technique. We're trenching, and then we are basically plumbing the hill slope at different sections across the base of the slope. And even soil pipes are getting their own tipping bucket devices. You see a couple of things on the screen showing you in the mid profile. These are soil pipes that are gushing water, and we measured those as well separately, but I won't talk too much about that today. Here's the hill slope again. We can do things compute the, we can compute the, sorry, my slides are going slowly here. We're looking at the hill slope again, and we can compute the topographic index. If you don't know what this is, basically we take every grid on this hill slope and we compute the A upslope area to that point, and we divide it by tangent beta, which is the local slope angle. So basically, if we're high up on the slope, we have a very low topographic index because we have very little upslope area and we have fairly steep topography. But if we come down the base of the slope, then in particular spots, as you can see by the flow paths that are inferred, we have a big area but a lower slope angle. And based on the subsurface topography, where that water is going to come out the base of the slope looks quite different to what the surface topography would imply. And this is what we're going to look at now on the hill slope. Here's the slope, and you see some of our techniques measuring the groundwater development at the soil bedrock interface, the perched water table that is. You're seeing devices measuring the sap flux up the trees. We have tensiometers and the trench at the base of the slope where I'm kind of standing taking this photo. But our question here is, how is this pre-event water mobilized? So now we're looking down on the hill slope, and each of these red dots represents a well that was completed at that soil bedrock interface, that bumpy surface. And again, the slope is about 20 meters by 40 meters. And here's a very small event showing you these patches of saturation that develop just down in the soil profile. It's not enough saturation to come to the surface, but it's detectable by our wells. Here's a slightly bigger event, more patches of saturation down in that bumpy subsurface. So these are filling, but what you're seeing is, as we go to larger events, this is a 16 millimeter rain event, more patches of saturation, almost 30 millimeters of rainfall, greater patches of saturation, 50 millimeters, but we're still not seeing a connectivity to the base of the slope down at the bottom of that hill slope. Now at 59 millimeters, we see connectivity, 61 millimeters connectivity. What does this mean? It means that if we look at the flow on the y-axis, and we look at precipitation on the x-axis, and each one of these dots is a different rainfall runoff event, you can see a clear threshold for generating lateral flow, this release of old water from the hill slope, and it's linked to the connectivity. So these patches of saturation are filling and then spilling and then creating this threshold-like response. So this was only for this one hill slope at this one catchment. We've since gone to many other catchments to document this kind of filling and spilling behavior. Here we're in New Zealand now. It's a steeper hill slope. It's wetter. Now we've gone to about 2,000 millimeters per year. And what you see is the same kind of behavior. Again, flow on the y-axis, precipitation on the x-axis, each dot representing a different rainfall runoff event. But now, rather than the threshold being about 60 millimeters of rain to activate this hill slope, this one's only about 20 millimeters of rainfall. We can go to the other end of the spectrum. This is a very topographically challenged area, we might say. This is in the coastal plain of South Carolina. And here, same kind of plot, what you're seeing is it takes a monstrous storm of about 150 millimeters to activate lateral flow. And again, at that interface between the soil and, in this case, the subsoil and argillic horizon. So these thresholds vary, but the process, I think, is the same. This filling and spilling that's needed to connect the hill slope and release the water stored in the hill slope to the stream. Here we've taken away the soil to see what that interface might look like. This happens to be at the Mai catchment in New Zealand. You can see the feet of one of my PhD students, Chris Graham, and he's releasing dyed water just to show how network-like it is, how concentrated some of the flow paths are that are along that soil bedrock interface. And I think this is showing really the importance of these boundary conditions that, again, we can only detect based on these kind of field investigations. So what I'm saying is this: these patches of saturation are really key for creating the precondition for lateral flow in the subsurface. So on the left-hand side, they're not yet connected. The middle plot, they're connecting, and as they connect, they start to produce flow from the base of the hill slope, and this flow increases on the right-hand side as the event continues. But really it's threshold-like, because without that connectivity, we don't have flow from the base of the hill slope. So we've really gone from, in hill slope hydrology, this idea of surface topography to now to the subsurface topography and microtopography that kind of dominates systems like I've been describing in these steep, wet areas. And in fact, these red dots represent areas where we've done this trenching. I've mentioned the sites in New Zealand and the sites on the far right-hand side in Georgia and South Carolina. We've also done it along the west coast of the United States, and then with collaborators in Japan. And what we see at all of these sites is a similar process, like shown in this cartoon. Water's infiltrating, it's ponding, it's backing up, it's coalescing these patches that then get connected and deliver lateral flow. But just like you saw early on in the early studies, even with that lateral flow, we're losing along the flow path to recharge groundwater. And this is then, of course, forming the base flow of the stream outside of these rainfall runoff events. So the hill slope activation is very episodic. And this can be aided and abetted by preferential flow. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but there's some lovely papers, or this is a lovely paper led by a group in the United States showing this kind of filling and spilling and how preferential flow can impact that. And even some early work by a postdoc of mine, Marcus Weiler, on the left-hand side. This was from the Maimai catchment, and using a model to try to understand the network-like behavior of soil pipes in terms of this whole filling and spilling connectivity process. So this is in keeping with the nature of preferential flow paths that many of us observe also on our hill slopes when we're doing our field studies. But what is our field challenge, I think, is this going forward. So we've kind of reviewed some of the early work by Hewlett, or Horton, I should say. We've talked about the work by Hewlett and others during the first international hydrological decade that shifted the focus from overland flow to subsurface flow. We talked about how isotopes changed our view to understand that it's really a release of water stored in the catchment prior to the event. Now our challenge, I think, is understanding the nature of this connectivity, and not just at the hill slope scale, but how hill slopes all through the landscape are connecting to the stream channel. Because often it's very threshold-like, and this is not easily predictable a priori. And I think our field measurements are hill slope trenching, distributed groundwater measurements, tracer experiments using stable isotopes, but even dye tracing, and even excavation. So trying to do a forensic analysis of flow paths, and then of course geophysical measurements. And I guess the point is that it's not just one of these, but as many of these as we can bring together to try to illuminate what's going on in our complex natural systems, I think, is really going to help us with our understanding and developing models that work for the right reasons. And that's really our hope going forward. All right, so let me try to wrap up. What I've been saying is how things have changed in the shortest history of hill slope hydrology after these three main time periods. And really, these were paradigm shifting events in terms of our thinking of how systems worked. And I hope I've given you some brief review of that today. So we've really talked about then how ideas have evolved, some of the key studies and methods that we've used, and why field work is so important. And what I want to leave you with, I guess, is maybe just some conclusions about field work. Because just like this quote from Mike Kirkby from 2004, as computer power becomes cheaper and field work more expensive, there's a trend away from field work and towards a complete dependence on simulation. And I think what we really need to recognize that, field work has yielded all the process insights we've gained since 1933. And there's still so much to discover. And hopefully, if you are able to tune in on Friday, I'll give you an idea of this with my lecture on isotope hydrology. And I think this week is such a terrific event in terms of stimulating interest in field work, and I hope all of you can have as much fun with field work as I've had over the last 3 decades. Thanks very much.
That was outstanding, Professor McDonald. And I think we have questions. We have about 10 minutes for the questions. So maybe, Professor Datta, okay, you follow yourself, one after another, whichever, yes. Feel free.
You're not heard.
Professor McDonald's, let me thank you for these 1 hour presentations, even if very early morning in your end. But it has racked up almost 100 years, 1933 to 2020. So we are almost 100 years. Now the hydrology has evolved it. But I have a very 2 questions for you. Whenever we conduct the field experiments, hill slope observations, we do the disturbance to the particular hill slope facets. Don't know things that because of that disturbance, we are changing these hydrological subsurface pathways. Yeah. The second question is that, as you told that the hill slopes subsurface flows behaves as a episodic events. It has a spill and fill approaches. It's connected during a particular extreme storm event. There is a thresholding behaviors. We have been observing the hill slopes in Northeast. What we have observed is that particular hill slope also, the thresholding values also changes year to years. It's not, really? It doesn't remain constant. That's what is quite interesting for us to observe from the hill slope experiments, that thresholding also for particular hill slopes also changes with year to years. No doubt there are the vegetations are there, the degree of the vegetations, the sops are changes it. So please have a my query on these. And second thing is, as you do the disturbance, it needs to have at least 1 or 2 years to come back to natural conditions. Yeah. So please enlighten me, our audience and all the things, how we can handle these 2 things.
Well, yeah, good questions. I mean, you know much more about your system than I do, but that's really fascinating that your threshold is changing year to year. I guess disturbance can have an impact. There's lovely work by Brunzeel. I don't know if you follow some of his work, L.A. Brunzeel, Semporno Brunzeel. Okay. And he's been looking at this nature of afforestation on degraded land in different parts of the world, and showing how it's very different response of afforestation if you're planting trees, for instance, on previously degraded or not degraded land. And as you're saying, a lot of it relates to the timescales of rebound, or maybe the evolution of those soils during that transition. So I don't know if that's part of maybe your experience in your sites, but that's really interesting, and I encourage you to publish that because that will be of interest to a lot of people. Yeah. Regarding your other question, though, on disturbance, you're right. That is our really one of our big challenges with field work. Anything we do can alter our system. We put in a weir in a stream, we alter the flow. We put in a groundwater well and we pump it, we're altering the cone of depression or maybe around the well. We dig a trench on a hill slope, we're now perhaps altering the flow paths. I think that one thing with trenching that we've learned is that if you do it near the stream and you do as wide a trench as possible, this can help to minimize the local impact where perhaps a small trench would be almost a sink for transient groundwater, rather than if you do something that's more in line with a natural stream bank, for instance, then you're having less impact. And there are some papers that have looked at this in terms of how to minimize the impact with different field approaches. But your question is an important one, and I think we're still grappling with as a community, even all these decades since some of the early field work. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
I want to intervene. Professor, it was a fantastic talk. I never knew that it has crossed an hour. But at some point of time, I think you missed telling about the piping. A lot of work has been done in piping in field hydrology, and in particular of interest to us is Western Ghats, where we find a rainfall of order of 7,000 millimeters, and piping contributes most of the subsurface flow.
Yeah.
So, would it be possible for you to highlight a bit on what has been done in this direction and what we can do in future to study this?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm not sure if I can share my screen again, but maybe I can just see if I can.
Why don't you
try and share my screen so I can show you something, if that's okay.
You have sufficient time. Don't worry about the time. We are here to hear you. So continue. Okay. If you have
can you see my screen?
Yes, we are able to. Yes, good.
Okay. So this is really exactly on your question. So my PhD work focused on soil piping and its ability to deliver old water to the stream. And this was the mechanism I observed, and I think we've observed it at other sites as well. So this is a steep hill slope in New Zealand, and you're seeing soil pipes at the base of this this kind of plot here on the left-hand side, those arrows. And what I observed by combining tensiometers with isotope measurements is that rainfall would enter these very permeable soils, but move via preferential flow vertically downwards. And it would back up at that soil bedrock interface and mix with a much larger quantity of stored water relative to the rainfall amount. So that the soil pipes, at least in my catchment, largely formed along that soil bedrock interface due to decayed root channels that were exploiting that. These were the delivery mechanisms for that old water, but they would only turn on when there was head above the soil pipe to force their flow, kind of almost like an agricultural engineer would design drain tubes to dewater a hill slope for agricultural purposes.
Yes.
So, but of course, soil pipes can develop in different ways in different places, and I'm sure you have much experience with soil pipes, probably in the Western Ghats. It'd be so interesting to. Do you find that the water in your soil pipes is old water, or is it more like rainfall? Or do you know yet?
Thank you.
So I'd be really curious to know if your soil pipe water was looking like rainfall or looking at like stored soil water. I would bet you a bottle of whiskey that it looks like stored soil water. But that'd be a great experiment to do.
Probably we'll be able to tell about it in a few months' time. We have a bit of results and we'll be telling about it.
Yeah,
a
excellent.
couple of months.
Excellent.
I have a question.
Lakshman is here.
I have a question.
Yes.
Professor Jeffrey,
Yes.
Lakshman Nandagiri here.
Nice
Thank you
to
very
meet
much
you.
for a wonderful presentation. In fact, I have heard you live at the pub event in TU Delft in 2012.
Okay.
We met there at that time.
Yes.
And thank you very much for a very wonderful presentation. My question was, since the time of Horton's proposed infiltration model and the infiltration excess runoff mechanism, it has taken us about 100 years to come out with operational hydrological models which implement that kind of an approach and provide us with predictions of stream flow and forecasts of stream flow. And I think you've reached a certain level of expertise in doing that. Now, from your presentation, we understand that there are other mechanisms which could be dominant in certain situations. So in your opinion, how much time and what kind of an effort is going to be needed to bring this to an operational scale? You come out with something that really, ultimately the question is going to be asked, how is this going to be useful to water resources engineering and development and management? Ultimately, that is the question that we would have to answer. So that I'm throwing a curvy at you. Pardon me for that, but I think you're in a much better position in terms of knowing what's been happening in the field to be able to at least give us a guess as to what kind of effort and what are the timelines that would be needed to put this into operational hydrology.
Well, hopefully it's not another 100 years. That would be very sad because I want to live to see it, and I won't be here in 100 years. I think that, through the pub effort, there's been a lot of work even since then trying to classify runoff behavior. And if we could come up with some classification metrics, maybe that would help to shorten the time from these field mechanism discoveries to implementation in a model. So I think there's a lot of work currently on trying to classify, come up with typologies of hill slopes and catchments. And some groups are doing wonderful work in that regard. Ross Woods at Bristol University, also Thorsten Wagner, he's there as well. Other groups are trying to group and classify systems based on this process behavior. I think also what didn't happen then, but is happening now, is this dialogue between experimentalist and modeler. And what we can do, and Jan Seibert at University of Zurich is doing a lot of this work with his group, trying to come up with these soft data measures, things that the experimentalist sees in the field and can use that for model calibration or testing or even understanding parameter ranges based on field observations. And these field observations, like I showed today, can be quite fuzzy and quite qualitative, but he's worked on developing fuzzy membership functions to actually inform that dialogue between experimentalist and modeler, and the so-called soft data measures. I think that's very helpful. And maybe the last thing, I guess, it's really realizing once and for all that probably most of our model uncertainty links to model structural uncertainty. And I think that's kind of been the most ad hoc part of a lot of our catchment models is the structure. And yet that structure, as it links to our perception of how these systems work from field-based studies, is all important. So I think there's a lot of growing awareness of that, and I'm optimistic for the future that it won't be hundreds of years. It might be 10 years or even tens of years, but I think the separation between the engineering and the scientific hydrology community is starting to be erased. And I think the pub decade really helped in that regard.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
These are great questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just to tell you that currently India is going through an era of hydrology, which I am calling the SWOT era. The SWOT model is the only thing that is being done.
Yeah.
You talk to any of these students today in working in hydrology, you'll find that they're using the SWOT model. Whether it works or not, whether it's giving us the right answers for the right reasons or it's giving us the right answers for the wrong reasons, we really don't know. So I think people like you must tell young audiences that there is more to hydrology than SWOT modeling.
Yeah. Well, it's part of that trend that I mentioned at the beginning slide, where we have a decline in fieldwork and increase in model-based simulations. I don't want to say anything bad about the SWOT model just because, modeling, as you know, is fit for purpose, and, all models are wrong and some models are useful. We know that. But it is an important point you make in that, what underlies a SWOT model is the curve number, and the curve number has nothing to do with runoff processes. So, maybe I won't say more than that, other than, it's exactly for certain questions, of course, SWOT model or other models like it can be very important, but it is important to recognize that it is process free. Yes. And that, I think going back to the comments at the beginning of this conference about encouraging early career folks and students to go into the field, it's like that joke that Tom Dunn used to say years ago, and the professor goes to do an exam of a PhD thesis, and the PhD is a modeling thesis, and the professor comes back to his own university and is writing the letter to say that the student passed, but at the end of the letter he said, for goodness sakes, before the student graduates, please tell them that runoff is produced by rainfall or snowmelt and not an excess of random numbers.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think we're still kind of in that.
You keep
that state sometimes,
I think Whit Clemesh also had some very funny stories like that. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Interesting point. Whit Clemesh used to work in the building that I'm in here in Canada. So we are with the spirit of Whit Clemesh all the time. Yeah.
Good. Thank you so much, Jeff. Wonderful talking to you and catching up with you. Thank you.
Is there any more question? Of course, there are a couple of questions.
Questions from participants.
Professor Manta.
Somebody said.
Professor Manta.
Participants.
Yeah, please.
There are a couple of questions from audience. Actually, they cannot ask the question directly. They can only give it in a chat form, and shall I read it?
Yeah,
you
can also do that. Sumit Sen and then Padi and others. Yeah,
if you are able to see that, you can read it then.
Yes, Sumit Sen has asked that with your vast field experience, do you think in Himalayas we can have saturation excess runoff generation mechanisms? Could you get it?
Well, I think one thing that's important to recognize is that you can have all of these runoff mechanisms happening in a single catchment in different places. And you could have Horton overland infiltration excess overland flow in your Himalayan catchment if you've got exposed bedrock, or maybe you've got snowmelt on frozen soil temporarily. And likewise, you can have subsurface storm flow in these steep basins probably, but also maybe right around the stream channel in these limited zones, you could have saturation excess overland flow. So I guess my answer would be, I would think it could be possible, but again, it's going to be maybe one of, how dominant one will be over the other. So in these very steep, wet places, often saturation overland flow is not so dominant, just because often the streams themselves are in highly incised, valley bottoms that really limits the expansion and contraction of those surface saturated zones. Yeah.
There are two more questions. The hill slope hydrology is quite dominant in stream origination process. However, why is it so that most of the current popular and advanced hydrological models have failed to include these concepts? And there is a second one, if you take that. What do you think if these processes are upscaled to watershed scale? Can these variations in hydrographs created by hill slope processes reflect or impact the hydrograph at watershed scale?
Good questions. So the reason why the reason why they're failed to include in our models is the same reason that Horton failed to include a lot of the things he observed in the model. It just wasn't practical. You know, during the early modeling days, I think people were realizing the incredible complexity of hill slopes and runoff processes, and that almost forced them more into highly simplistic overland flow driven models because they were practical, they were doable. It seemed impossibly complex to add some of those elements at the time into the modeling approaches. And this is where I think that quote by Sivapalin comes in. We need a way to whittle down all of this complexity to deliver something more straightforward at the catchment scale. And one of those things I think are the connectivity threshold, a way to ultimately, my hope is that we can go into the field and diagnose hill slope behavior based on their threshold activation and not have to worry about all the gory details of preferential flows and highly spatial variability hydraulic conductivities. Now, the other question about upscaling, that's tricky because all of these runoff processes are scale dependent. So just imagine you're in your Himalayan basin and you're on a small hill slope, and maybe this is a small hill slope that's seasonally frozen ground. And the runoff is one way there, but you upscale then to the catchment or the large watershed, and what's dominating could be really quite different. So I think the second question about upscaling, it's recognizing the extreme scale dependency, but asking the question, what is common across these scales? And I think you first need to identify the scale that you're interested in, and then search for this kind of filling and spilling threshold-like behavior. It might be small hill slope elements, or it might be larger elements of the landscape that are kind of filling and draining. But yeah, two good questions.
I guess we are done with the questions, unless I don't see. Okay, there is one more. My question is, how do we analyze the measures you are going to take while working in a new area? It must be needing exhaustive studies.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And this speaks to, I think, the top-down approach versus the bottom-up approach. So bottom-up, I mean reductionist science, kind of like I was describing today. The top-down approach is really starting at the larger scale and starting simply and then getting more detailed. There's a group in Scotland, Chris Soulsby and Dorte Tetzlaff. They've really done impressive work with the top-down approach. So their approach is going into a new watershed, just take some isotope samples to understand how old the water is or how things are behaving at the full catchment scale. And then when you get a picture of that, then zoom in on a smaller catchment and then zoom in on maybe a hill slope, rather than try to start with measurements of an infiltrometer ring and try to expand out from there. So Soulsby and Tetzlaff have some very nice papers along those lines. And it's an excellent question. But I'd say one important way is using the top-down approach, maybe, to address that concern.
Can we take last two very brief questions?
Sure.
One is from Archana. Are rainfall simulators a good alternative for field measurement in hill slope hydrology? And the other one, I think you can take that. In connection with your hill slope hydrology model, which model is more realistic as of now?
Yeah, I think rainfall simulators can be very good in the field. Again, it's over a small area, so you need to be conscious of the fact that you may not have all the variability of your system contained in that small area. This is the whole idea of representative elementary volume or area. You saw from some of those hill slope examples, we really needed to get to a certain scale to see the kind of filling, spilling, and connectivity. But I think rain simulation can be a very helpful thing, especially if you add a tracer to the rain. That would really be exciting, because then you can not only trace the hydrograph response, but you can trace the particle transport. Could be a dye tracer, could be an isotope tracer, could be a chloride tracer. In terms of hill slope models, again, I don't want to say anything critical of any particular approaches. My approach is to be more agnostic about models and to use them as a hypothesis testing tool. So in my work, we've used everything from the TUF2 model to Hydrus 3D to hydrogeosphere. Recent work has worked with the Cathy model. These are mostly Darcy Richards solvers that we can now apply at the hill slope scale. But even conceptual models, Marcus Weiler, who's a professor at Freiburg University, has a model called HILL-V, and it's a conceptual distributed model. We found that to be very useful. But again, I view models as more of a hypothesis testing tool to help me with my field-based process understanding rather than the end itself. It's a means to an end. But I guess I have the luxury that I'm not an engineer designing a bridge or a highway, and so I have that luxury. Whereas some of you may need to be actually making predictions because you're coming from an engineering background. And again, I guess it's fit for purpose. And it's what model you have the data necessary to run that model. And many of these models require this kind of detailed information. The last thing I'd mention, though, whatever hill slope model you might be using, recognize that the fact that it's all about the interface, whether it's the surface interface and the micro topography for overland flow, or that subsurface interface that's so important for subsurface storm flow. The boundary conditions are the science, and I think that's a really important message for modelers, how crucial getting the boundary conditions correct are, because that can really affect all models.
Professor McDowell, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I guess, yes, the engineers perhaps cannot have as many questions that you have kind of asked, because even our graduate students, if they even ask a fraction of those questions when they interface hydrology, that will be enormous. But I guess, yes, the gap has to reduce. We are taking hydrology and particularly hill slope hydrology too much for granted. We're not asking almost any question at all. This is somewhere I think you underscored the point very convincingly that field hydrology has no substitute. One has to really put your hands into the water. I'm sure you have inspired us a lot for your Friday talk as well. I'm sure everybody will be joining again to listen to you, and probably all the residual questions we can keep for then. Professor Datta, is it all right? Because I think time is an issue. Otherwise, this can go on for any time.
Yes, it's all right, sir.
All right. So then we wrap up this talk with once again thanking Professor Jeffrey McDonald enormously for such an enlightening engagement. I think in a long time this has been a fascinating talk that we have really engaged into. And I give it over to Professor Kartha for concluding session, or Professor Datta, whoever takes over.
Okay, Professor Mantha, thank you. Thank you for the moderating the event so nicely. And I also thank Professor Jeffrey McDonald. He has really taken it was like a trance to all of us.
Of
for
course.
the last 90 minutes, we did
Yes.
we were taken through such a wonderful way of about the hill slope hydrology, the history about that, and that yet it has really enlightened us. We thank as from the organizing committee as well as from all the attendees. I really thank. And there are many questions too. It is published there. Even Professor Mudushekhar has asked questions. Dr.
Yes, we could not take all of them.
Yeah, but due to time constraint, I think you may be, if these questions we can post to you and you can reply to them also, Professor McDonald. Yeah.
I think he can come back on another day and answer the questions on the computers on the net itself. Why not? He may come before the last day. We have a bit of time for him to come back and answer these questions. He will have time to think and keep ready his answers. Okay, it should be possible for us to provide that time. So thank you very much, sir. It was a fantastic evening, fantastic made by all the people, even from IIT. So thank you all from our side.
This is really great gratitude from my side because of enlightening us, our students, and really, sir, we are looking forward to meet you again on Friday, and so we'll have a really good. We have started.
We will have a change in schedule that time.
Oh.
We'll see what best can be done.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Let us close this one. Thank you all.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Just put on the mic. Yeah. Thank you.
Wow, it's good.
You have to announce. Suresh, you have to announce the program for that program tomorrow.
From 40% it became 0.
You have to announce programs for tomorrow.